Greetings to the midwives of New Zealand. I'm making this video to talk to you about the vision for a stronger partnership. Some of you may know me. My name is Wintergreen, and I'm speaking to you today because of my deep and long-standing love for the New Zealand midwifery partnership model, a respect I've carried since arriving in New Zealand in 1995, 35 years ago. The love of this partnership model seemed to dovetail perfectly with the childbirth concept families with whom I had worked had asked me to carry forward since the early 1970s. The concept was the importance that all expectant families self-learn birth and coaching skills for use in all births. Although I started a new life in New Zealand in 1995, I had 25 years of previous experience in the childbirth area, as well as living, working, and giving birth first in the U.S. in 1970, which was during the last few years of the first ever childbirth trend, which was skills-based, Lamaze, and some Bradley classes. Lamaze was taught in every hospital in every state from the late 1950s to the mid-1970s. Here's what was happening in the U.S. then, and that's not the same as in New Zealand. Multiple millions of U.S. families attended Lamaze and Bradley classes. Fathers coached, women coped better in birth. Providers loved working with skilled families. My generation had lasting positive birth memories for all birth experiences, and we built stronger families. There was no risk evaluation of women. There were no midwives. Obstetricians were the lead maternity carer, and there was lots of medical assessments, monitoring procedures. Together, multiple millions of women and men did the activity of giving birth. The results were recognized by everyone that women coped better, but this was not valued by the beginning natural birth movement, nor was coping in alignment with the three goals of that movement, which were natural birth, pain-free labor without medical care, targeting low-risk women. Said again, in the skills-based childbirth trend for over 20 years, women coped better, fathers were great coaches, birth providers loved working with families using some level of skills, even though there were no choices back then. However, what was achieved was not acknowledged, nor did it fit into the three natural birth movement goals, which were natural birth, pain-free labor based on childbirth without fear, with no medical care. Those were the clearly expressed goals of the growing natural birth movement, and they haven't changed much. Because those three goals were not met using skills, and there was no acknowledgement that birth and birth coaching skills dealt with the number 2 childbirth goal, which was how to deal with suffering, skills were totally abandoned. Cows and cats aren't taught, birth's instinctive, women should be left alone. And the new global natural birth movement focused exclusively on choice. Women know what kind of birth they want, and care providers should give them that birth via birth plans. So in 1970, at my first birth, my husband and I used birth and birth coaching skills along with that generation of multiple millions of U.S. families. It was the norm. But when I gave birth again in 1982, it was during this new choice-based childbirth trend put in place in the early 1980s. Women made birth plans. The classes were solely information. No skills were taught. Fathers no longer coached. There were more choices in hospital in the U.S., and some states began to recognize midwives. There were always some home births, but the mummy wars started. Natural versus medical birth, home versus hospital birth, midwife versus obstetrician birth, and even the concept that having a cesarean wasn't a real birth and only a natural birth was. And then it was also about saying no to what was now called interventions, and implied that assessments and monitoring and procedures were all unnecessary and imposed on women. There was a huge increase in the C-section rate in the 1980s, also due to societal changes, and a huge rise in TABs or post-birth trauma because suffering came back again, and more family issues arrived because fathers now were left out. The societal changes that took place in the U.S. in the early 1980s had a huge impact on birth. Birth control, legal abortion, women going into the workforce, workforce and therefore smaller families. New Zealand's childbirth history from the 50s to the 70s was not the same as the US. However, I was in the dark about the New Zealand childbirth history in 1995 when I immigrated. I had to read Trouble with Women, The History of Parent Centre, which was published in 1990, and eventually Women's Business, The History of New Zealand Midwifery, which was published in 2010. As a body worker from the early 1970s, I had worked with many hundreds of mothers and fathers who developed all the skills in birthing better at the end of the skills-based childbirth trend in the US. Bluntly, birthing better skills came about because families wanted more adaptable and sustainable skills than either Lamaze or Bradley could give them. There's no shame there because those were the very first skills for use in birth. And birthing better families were trying to answer the what-if questions. What could I have done? Or what could I do? And I just want to say, no, traditional communities do not have birth skills for women. I've lived and worked in 30 of them. Skills in pregnancy, before birth and after birth, are there in every traditional community. The do's and don'ts in pregnancy and the do's and don'ts with a newborn. But all traditional communities exist within the same childbirth reality, which exists today. There's no way to know what your birth will be like, but that's followed by a sentence which is inaccurate. Therefore, there's very little you can do to prepare for it. Lamaze and Bradley were saying, yes, there is something you can do about it for low-risk women. Learn some skills. But in fact, all pregnant women and all birthing women and their partners can learn and use skills. The Pink Kit first launched in New Zealand in 2000, but it was only the body skills of a much larger set of skills now available online. Technology back then was not like today. By the mid-1980s, the global natural birth movement brought natural birth advocates together worldwide to discuss the future of birth. Now people in New Zealand have had 35 years to reflect on their midwifery partnership that developed because of that global natural birth movement partnership across countries. During the decades prior to my immigration in New Zealand, I had learned a vitally important lesson. Expectant families are influenced by the healthcare system wherever they live. Yet 100% of pregnant women will do the activity of birthing our babies without exception. No matter the birth, it's an activity, not something that just happens to women. We don't give birth, we do birth actively. And having self-learned birth and coaching skills and then applying those skills during this life-transforming activity has a huge positive personal impact on women and an enormous positive impact on fathers who coach, and the same within the family in general. Some of you might remember the childbirth conversation in the 1980s that led to New Zealand midwives becoming the lead maternity carer. As mentioned in the 1980s, the natural birth movement went global. That movement wanted midwifery-led maternity for low-risk women. They wanted women's choices respected to say no to medical interventions and to have home births. In reality, New Zealand put in place the ideal midwifery partnership that included so much more. All services were paid by the government. New Zealand midwives included all expectant parents, not just low risk. They set up an autonomous profession with their own education, standards of practice, and discipline. They were direct entry based, had a partnership model with the midwives who worked both in the district health board and the community midwives, all respecting women's choices. And midwives often remained the lead maternity carer, even with an obstetrical referral. Yet when I arrived in 1995, it was obvious the partnership was not strong and inevitably would lead to midwifery exhaustion from doing too much and working with unskilled families who expected their birth plans or choices to unfold and given to them. In reality, by the 1990s, birthing women everywhere no longer tolerated previously accepted long labors. Please keep in mind that I'm just scratching the surface of the issues and elements of childbirth. New Zealand immigration welcomed me in 1995, specifically because I was bringing into the country both birth and coaching skills directed towards families to self-learn and then use for their birth within this partnership. New Zealand immigration saw this approach directed toward the consumer partner within the midwifery model as a way for there to become a stronger partnership between clients and their midwives. Immigration told me that New Zealanders were cluey, number 8 wire people who liked to be skilled. Because I was not familiar with these cultural qualities, I was just honored that immigration could see the benefits that families had asked me to carry forward. I was certain I was in the right place at the right time, and that I could effectively explain the benefits to expectant families to self-learn birth and coaching skills and apply those skills as they do the activity of birthing their babies in all births, and the benefits to New Zealand midwives. My previous 25 years had shown these benefits clearly, but we had no way to record or research. In hindsight, my lack of knowledge of New Zealand childbirth from the 1950s to the 70s made it impossible for me to speak from understanding. The lack of knowledge that New Zealanders had about the same time period in the US meant we were talking and thinking past one another. However, we are now 40 years past when the natural birth movement became global, 35 years from when New Zealand midwives set up their partnership, and 30 years from when I immigrated. And in hindsight, we can now more clearly see how the partnership model has worked and where the gaps are that I could see back then, purely by accident, and having given birth at the end of one childbirth trend and the beginning of the other, and seeing the stark differences that impacted multiple millions of American families. However, it turns out that New Zealand was way ahead of the game. New Zealand always had midwives. In the US, they were illegal. In New Zealand, GPs were the primary maternity care, while in the US, it was OBs. Home births were possible in New Zealand, while in the US and some states actually illegal. And then there was H.R. Brandt's study done at National Women's in 1962. Did you know about it? I stumbled across this 6-page study as a tiny footnote in Women's Business published in 2010. Brandt's study clearly showed what I had experienced in my own birth in 1970, and by those multiple millions of American families who became skilled for that generation. Brandt's study showed exactly what the skills-based childbirth trend in the U.S. had shown and what was ignored by the natural birth movement. Women coped better. Midwives loved working with skilled women, and babies had better APGARs. The Brandt study, however, did not include fathers as birth coach because in New Zealand, fathers were not yet permitted to attend as they were in the U.S. The study didn't separate high and low risk women, neither did Lamaze classes in the U.S., nor did Brandt put any emphasis on the type of birth experienced, while Lamaze classes in the U.S. preferred natural birth. Therefore, in Brandt's study, women were taught a simple set of skills by others and were coached by others. And we have to talk about that in the future. At that time, Parent Center was teaching natural birth classes based on Childbirth Without Fear, published originally in 1942. But women had to be risk evaluated as low risk by their GP before they could attend natural birth classes. Of course, I'm short-forming everything in a complex topic with lots of nuances. So just to recap, I arrived in New Zealand in 1995. New Zealand midwives had achieved the pinnacle of the global natural birth movement and much more, an autonomous practice, direct entry midwifery partnership that served all expectant New Zealand families based on choice. The enthusiasm and belief in success was high in 1995. My suggestion at the 1996 NOSCOM conference that mothers and fathers should be skilled and fathers should be the birth coach within the partnership didn't fit into the vision, which was to increase home births and decrease the 12.9% C-section rate to align with the WHO's rate, which back then, in 1990, was 9%. Today, in 2025, the WHO rate is 10 to 15%, and the C-section rate in New Zealand under midwifery care is now 32 to 34%. In reality, when I came to New Zealand in 1995, midwives who were community midwives were referred to as the real midwives, and those working in the district health board were often called midwives. But thankfully, this has changed. But after I spoke in 1996 at the New Zealand conference, I was bluntly told that New Zealand midwives would never support anything I did, and they haven't. But I keep trying because I have such a love for this midwifery partnership once it becomes stronger. There was another huge gap. Because the global natural birth movement rejected skills by the late 1970s, no other childbirth skills method was developed for 20 years, from the 70s to the 90s, except the continued development of birthing better, but technology wasn't like it is today. It was understandable in 1995 that New Zealand midwives thought I was self-promoting, They didn't understand that I was promoting a stronger partnership, and that while libraries could provide some childbirth resources, the Pink Kit was the only mixed media resource available, and only in 2000 onwards. After the 1996 NOSCOM conference, I set up a nonprofit called Common Knowledge. Technology caught up, and in 2000, the Body Skills, the Pink Kit, the VHS, the book, and the cassette was launched in New Zealand and online. But something then happened. Andrea Vincent approached us. She bought 20 Pink Kits and gave the Pink Kits to her clients, and began a 20-year personal project to strengthen her partnership. And she had great success. However, there were steps towards strengthening her partnership and hurdles and hiccups. Common Knowledge Trust, me, and Birthing Better were always very clear in our how-to message. Families should self-learn skills and use them. And here are some of the hurdles Andrea ran into. Andrea worked in a profession where choice still remains a legal element, so she didn't feel she could push her clients to self-learn skills. Some midwives thought that they should teach the skills, but they're already doing too much. Some saw the body skills as natural interventions and believed they should do the body skills on women, but no, they shouldn't. Preferably the father and other person or coach should do any of the body skills on women who have already worked through the Birthing Better skills. And I'll explain that later. Many midwives in New Zealand agree with the philosophical viewpoint that cows and cats aren't taught, and women don't need to be, but they should just be left alone to discover birth. In fact, that's what it says in the midwifery guidelines. And midwives stand in their own way via the choice-based childbirth trend. Midwives are trying to give women the birth they want, while both mothers and fathers who are adults, who need skills for themselves, that give themselves the confidence moving into parenting. New Zealand pregnant women feel entitled but dependent, and midwives are exhausted. The above issues did have an impact on Andrea's clients. At first, only 20% of her clients said yes. Eventually, she did find ways over time to get between 70 and 80% of her clients to self-learn Birthing Better skills. When she started in 2000, she had been in practice 20 years. She was tired, and she had a C-section rate of 23%. Within 2 years, her C-section rate went down to between 4 and 9%, and stayed that way for 20 years. And she loved working with skilled families, and remained in the profession for many more years. She spoke at a number of conferences. We taught strengthening the partnership workshops, and Common Knowledge Trust put out our flyer to 3,600 midwives in 2018 or sometime around there, inviting 100 to 150 midwives to study with me for 2 years and strengthen their partnership, as well as the handout of the skills-based methods known at that time. Not one step forward. Why has the New Zealand midwifery arrived at this moment in time? There are so many factors, yet we are here. The professional friendship that midwives have can now be used to strengthen the partnership, honor choices, and get more and more consumers to take on their adult partnership capacity and responsibility to self-learn birth and coaching skills and use those skills, whether they labor and have a vaginal birth, have a planned or unexpected cesarean. The woman is always doing the activity of birthing her baby. Your consumer partners appreciate that you are skilled. Now's the time for you to appreciate that the adults you work with can be skilled to do their task. Andrea's success was the living example that Brandt's study showed, and what the skills-based childbirth trend showed in the U.S., and why I have always had this profound and abiding excitement and love of how New Zealand midwives structured their profession. And the potential for a strong partnership has always been there and can now be implemented. Won't you come on this exciting adventure with me, and hopefully having Andrea help as well? Even if just 20% of the 50,000 births every year in New Zealand said yes, right away, as Andrea discovered in the first year, that's a change. And once you start to work consistently with more families, you'll encourage more. And more in your community will know this is what you expect. Imagine the future of the New Zealand Midwifery Partnership as a strong one, with both partners having skills for their task and their role and their jobs. I've seen it since 1995. I see the potential, and I hope you'll begin to see it too. One thing I want to say, when a woman moves from labor to an unplanned C-section Just encourage her and her partner to continue to use their skills while waiting, being prepped, and during surgery, and even afterwards. This is their baby's birth. For planned C-sections, learning skills in pregnancy together strengthens the family, and skills can be used on the way to the hospital and as above. This is their baby's birth. And the memories of doing that birth are beautifully heightened when we remember how well we cope and manage with the help of our partner, family, or loved one. So here we are, and here's my proposals. There are two of them. One, to have an informal look-see rather than a top-down study. And then evaluate, and then perhaps have a wider adoption. So the look-see number one, 100 to 150 midwives work online with me to individually implement the script on the flyer and give out the handout, and use simple notation and simple evaluation for 2 years, because pregnancy takes a while, and the cost per midwife is 50 New Zealand dollars a month per person. My hope is that Andrea will come on board, but who knows? The look-see number two is those midwives going through the disciplinary process also join this study, but a separate group for a 2-year period, but doing the same thing as the look-see number one, and then evaluate, and the cost is 50 New Zealand dollars per month per person. Here's the reality. I'm about to turn 82. I have the energy to do this. I can see this strong partnership. I've seen it since I arrived in New Zealand. It hasn't been what New Zealand midwives have wanted. Andrea showed it's possible. The brand study showed that all families using skills birth better. We can do this. And the reality is, it's now or never. Like it or not, I'm the person who knows how to do this. And this is why I'm reaching out now, because I believe we can do this and it can change very, very quickly.